Rest in peace, Ryan. Miss you, buddy. So there's an issue regarding what day Jesus died. Partly because the story has after his resurrection on the weekend for sure, right? But the question is, the day before he died was the preparation day, which is the day before the Sabbath when they prepare for the Sabbath. Traditionally, everyone's considered, Good Friday. He died on Good Friday. And how is that 3 days and 3 nights, etc.? Well, if he's dead on the day before the Sabbath, he dies before the Sabbath ends, and then they bury him at sundown. He's dead all Saturday, and then he raises on the day after the Sabbath. He's dead on 3 different days. Some people don't accept that, so they push it back. Well, we know the text says he died on a preparation day, but other people point out that because he died on Passover, which is also a Sabbath associated with the festivals, because they had the day that was the Sabbath, that wasn't a weekly Sabbath. And most people don't talk about that. And one of the reasons people say it's a problem regarding it being a weekly Sabbath is because the women come with spices to prepare for his body when they find him raised, when they come on the Sunday morning, let's say, the day after the Sabbath morning when they show up. That everybody agrees that's certainly the weekly Sabbath. So we know that in the context of taking him down from the cross, that it was the Sabbath was about to begin, and so they're hurrying to get him buried before this because the Sabbath drew on. Now, if it's a weekly Sabbath, there's no question that he died on a Friday or the day before the Sabbath. Of course, the next day starts at sundown, right? So it would have been Friday night, and he died before the nighttime came because that would be considered on the Sabbath, and that certainly wouldn't qualify for 3 days, being dead on 3 different days. But one of the issues that someone who doesn't believe in the Friday Jesus dying on the day before the Sabbath, but rather during the middle of the week, which is when they suggest the Passover would have fallen, that he died on the preparation day for the Sabbath of the festival. Otherwise, you don't get 3 full days and nights. So it depends on how you define 3 days. Now, one of the issues that's brought up by those who advocate for this non-traditional view, which I'll just be frank with you, I don't buy, because it's hard for me to imagine that the church would have made the arguments they did about changing the Sabbath or whatever, or keeping Sunday, the day, of his resurrection being on the day after the Sabbath. It's hard to imagine how they could have messed that up. That's one of the main reasons why it's hard for me. But I listen to the arguments and I want to be honest with them. I take the Friday view, but they have interesting arguments. But one of the main contentions I think people have is the spices. So it says they're rushing to get him off of the cross before Sabbath begins. And the people will point out that they came on the day they find him raised, they went to go use the spices on his body. Well, if he dies and it's a weekly Sabbath, then when would they have bought the spices? Because they wouldn't have bought them on the Sabbath. And if they were rushing to get him off the cross on Friday night, they wouldn't have ever had a time, because it was still dark when they went to his tomb on Sunday morning. So when would they have bought the spices? Because it says they came with spices to anoint his body. Well, they didn't have time to buy it the night of getting him off the cross. And that seems like a reasonable argument. And I think that's reasonable. So there are 2 things I thought of just off the top of my head. Is it doesn't say they went to buy spices. It says that they took spice. So it doesn't say anything about when they bought it in the text. So I posited 2 hypotheses, that either they were getting the spices when they knew he was dying before sundown, and then other of the women went to get the spices and the men were dealing with Jesus' body, maybe. That's one option. It's kind of iffy though. Or somebody had the spices already. That one seemed more plausible to me. Now, in the New Testament, there's 2 things going on regarding Jesus' death. There's plenty of narratives there in the text that point out that they weren't believing that he was going to die, even though he plainly told them that he was going to go die and suffer these things. John 14 is one example. John 13 and 14. But the only evidence we really get in the narrative is that they just don't even believe it, that he's going to die. Even in many examples. So that would suggest that they wouldn't have pre-planned his death, right? Well, the text also shows us that he was telling him he was going to die. We don't know. They may have they must have acknowledged him saying it. And it's not recorded, of course, but he must have been telling them, but they wouldn't believe it. But you could argue that some of them believed it, but they didn't want to believe it. Some of them just flat didn't believe it. You can speculate all you want, but I noticed something when I was studying this morning, reading my Bible this morning, that was interesting. Let me share that with you regarding the answer to this question. When did they buy the spices? It's in John 12. Notice this. They took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? We could have sold that. Why are you wasting it? We could have, done good deeds for the poor. This he said, not that he cared for the poor. He didn't really have the poor in mind, but because he was a thief and had the bag and bare what was put therein. He was the one who owed the money for the group. Notice this, though. Then said Jesus, leave her alone. Against the day of my bearing has she kept this. For you always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. Now, when he says that, you could take this that he's saying she didn't even know she had this for that purpose. That's one way you could read it. But if you just take it plainly and literally, it suggests that they had bought this to anoint his body, presumably because he had told them he's going to die, just like he says right here that he's going to die, or he alludes to it. You will not always have me. You kept this against my burying. In other words, they had this perfume for his death and his burial. So, and she used it before he died to anoint his feet. And Judas complained about it because it seemed like a waste. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Against the day of my bearing, she has kept this. For the poor you all. So look, that suggests to me absolutely that at some point they must have had the burial spices and ointments and perfumes for burial, because Jesus had been telling them that he will be going to his death, although they didn't believe it. So to me, this is plenty of evidence to suggest that, well, they already had the ointment and the spices for burial. Even if they didn't believe he would die, at some point they bought things for that purpose, as we see here in John 12:7. So there you go. Friday crucifixion, 1 point. Not Friday crucifixion, no points. And may God have mercy. I'm just kidding. Peace.